I say that, and I gotta find it again. There it is. And welcome to another exciting episode of The Energy That Surrounds Us. I'm your host, Michael. And tonight's episode, due to the location of my guest, is being pre-recorded. So if you are commenting in the chat room, please do not feel like we are ignoring you. It is most likely that we have not seen your messages yet, and so we will respond accordingly. With that being said, I am joined today by a guest who I found on LinkedIn, and I am very excited to bring her on the show. So without further ado, I give you the one, the only, the amazing, talented Ruth Roper Wylde.
Hi, everyone. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing really, really well. It's been a nice sunny day here in England for a change. After all the rain we've had lately, it's made quite a change to actually have a sunny day. So that's been a good day.
Well, I'm sorry I'm keeping you from the sun.
It's evening here now, so it's just starting to set.
Oh, perfect timing.
Perfect timing.
So for those who aren't familiar with you, could you give a little bit of background in what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a paranormal researcher and author based here in the UK in England. And I am currently researching for my 9th book. So I'm 8 books in. I started my research when I was still at school, actually. So that's going back quite a lot of decades without giving too much away about my age. Because I happen to live in a house with a very active poltergeist at that time. And I really, really wanted to know what it was we were living with. My mother had a very scientific bent of mind, so she was always looking for a scientific type of explanation for what was going on. And I found that I would be reading books or trying to find articles, but this was long before the internet was available. So what really bothered me was that here in England, anyway, so many of the books and everything that we could pick up were talking about dusty old ghosts in dusty old castles and old mansions, last seen back in 17 something or other or 18 something or other. And I didn't want to know about that. I wanted to know about ghosts that people are putting up with in their ordinary daily lives, in their ordinary houses. So I started sort of keeping notes on any I found that were more modern. And then obviously I grew up, got a job, left school. But I kept that interest in the paranormal as a hobby, and still kept up with my notes and my little database notes that I'd created. And eventually time rolled around, and it got to the stage where I had the opportunity to partially retire early from work. So I went down from full-time to 3 days a week in 2016. And I thought, oh, what can I do with my other 4 days a week now? I know, I'll take a look at that database and perhaps I could put a little book out or something with some of the information. And I had absolutely no idea how you put a book out or how to be an author or anything, but can't be hard, I'll figure it out. So I spent the first few months of my retirement thinking, well, I better start with something quite small just to sort of test the waters, feel how it feels to be an author, see what happens. So I decided to write a book about the ghosts just immediately around here where I live, because I live in a very old village, just about 50 miles north of London, and it's called Marston Vale, and it dates back to at least Saxon times. So obviously there's quite a lot of myths and legends around here, and I thought it's bound to be a few ghosts if I ask. So I just put cards in the shop windows and put something out on the village social media posts and asked if anybody was willing to talk to me. Interviewed anybody who was willing to talk to me about their ghosts, about their experiences, and delved a little bit into the sort of myths and history around here. And so I wrote my first book. It took about 6 months to do that research with the villagers around here. And that was the Ghosts of Marston Vale. It's only a very short book because obviously, it's only about one small area. But it just gave me a way of figuring out how to be an author, how to research, how to put it all together. And I published that right at the beginning of 2017. So about January the 4th of 2017. And yeah, I enjoyed it so much. I thought, right, that's one out. Let's see what I can do with now the database of all this information I've gathered for all these years. I'd probably get 2 books out of that, and then that'll be me done, I thought. I'll have done what I wanted to do, and I'll be able to hang my hat up on that one, and it's a job well done, and leave it alone, sort of thing. So I took a look at the database of information I'd got and realised that it was too much for one book. So I decided to split it into 2 categories. One, all those ghosts that haunt supposedly on just one night of the year, anniversary ghosts or cyclical ghosts, they're sometimes referred to as. And one, all those ghosts that haunt roads, byways, streets, alleyways, anywhere that isn't a building, basically. So the Almanac of British Ghosts came out next. That came out at the end of 2017. And that's literally what it says on the tin. It's a calendar of all the ghosts that are supposed to haunt on one date a year in the UK. And it's just laid out sort of, exactly like a calendar, January, February, March, etc. And with each one, I look into the history of why it's supposed to haunt that night. Wherever possible, debunk the history of the haunting happening that night. And then I went out trying to see if I could find anybody who'd actually experienced the haunting, either on that night or in that location. And then the third book that came out was the Roadmap of British Ghosts. And I had immense fun with that one. That one was huge fun to write because I had loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of locations all around the UK of roads and byways and streets and alleys and what have you where there were supposed to be ghosts. And I went out on social media trying to see if anybody had actually seen these ghosts or actually experienced anything there. And having spent most of my career in investigative type work, I was very careful not to lead the witnesses and sort of say, have you seen the black monk that's supposed to haunt the A5 or the white lady who's supposed to haunt, such and such a street. I would just say, has anybody experienced anything they can't explain along such and such a road or such and such a street? And actually that turned out to be a really great way to do it because people immediately started responding and writing into me and saying, oh yeah, I've had this or that or the other happen there. Or people would say, well, I haven't there where you're actually asking about, but a mile down the road or 5 miles over or, when I was coming home from work one night on a different road entirely, I saw X, Y, and Z. So, of course, all of this went onto my database. And I got loads and loads and loads of personal accounts that had never been published before. These people had never come forward before. So the book's chock-a-block full of personal accounts. And that meant that when I actually then published that book in 2018, I suddenly realised that my database had kind of filled back up again with all these other locations that people had given me. Plus people had written in and said, I haven't seen one out on the road, but I've got one in my house, or I've got one at my workplace, or I used to work in a pub and that was really haunted and things happened while I was there. So that made me realise that, now I kind of need another book that isn't about the roads. I need one for people's own experiences in buildings. So I started the These Haunted Times series because I realised quite quickly that it's almost like painting the Forth Bridge, as we say here in the UK, which is a really, really long bridge up in Scotland. And, the saying goes that you start painting one end, and by the time you get all the way across it and finish painting the other end, it needs painting back at the beginning again because it takes so long to paint it. And so that's a saying, it takes as long as painting the Forth Bridge. And I realised it was kind of like that. That's just, as fast as I emptied the database, because people were writing in with their stories, it was filling back up again. So I started These Haunted Times, which has now got volumes 1, 2, 3, and 4. Have all been published over sort of subsequent years. And whilst getting the stories for those, I got loads more road ghosts. So the Roadmap of British Ghosts, Volume 2, got published as well, which was quite funny because when I wrote the first roadmap, I honestly and really quite naively thought that would be the definitive work on the ghosts that haunt our roads. So I only called it the Roadmap of British Ghosts. I didn't give it a volume number. And now I wish I had, because now I've got the Roadmap of British Ghosts Volume 2. But there, you live and learn, don't you? So now whenever I write a book, it's going to get a volume number just in case. So that's what I've been doing. I do a lot of obviously going out to these locations myself to see if I can experience anything there. I absolutely love it when my readers go out to the locations. I've got a lot of paranormal groups follow my work, and they'll go out to the locations that I've sort of highlighted and see if they can experience anything, and will write to me if they have, which is absolutely brilliant. So my books make quite a good reference for paranormal investigators, particularly when I'm talking about a public location. I'm very careful with private locations not to reveal exactly what the location is, and I don't give the names of my witnesses unless they specifically ask me to. So I always say, in the foreword of every book, it says all the names in the book are pseudonyms, unless the person has specifically asked me to use their name, which sometimes paranormal investigators do, and sometimes members of the public do, but mostly people prefer to have a pseudonym. And that's fine, because I think it's really important to protect their privacy if they want to have it protected. So that's what I've been doing. So very busy few years. And obviously I love to come on to podcasts such as yours and talk about what I do. So that's another route that I'm now doing. So busy, very busy.
I can imagine, and wow. I sit here and people say you should write a book, and I'm like, I can't even get past thinking of page 1 title. And here you are, like, working on, what was it, book 12? It's like, wow.
Book 9, yeah. Book 9 at the moment. Mad. It wouldn't have been quite so many, but I did go slightly insane last year, I think, because I was writing These Haunted Times Volume 3, and I was merrily researching away and typing away and researching away and typing away, having an absolute whale of a time, and all of a sudden my computer went, "You have reached the Google word limit." And I kind of went, I've done what now? I didn't even know it had a word limit. Apparently it does. It's at 676 pages, A4 size pages. Wow. And I thought, I've got a bit mad there. That's way too big for a book. Because obviously if you published a book that size, well, A, people would need a cart to take it home in. And B, can you imagine what the cost would be? I'd hate to think what the cost would be. So I thought, it's okay. I'll just split it into 2 books and just do 2 books at once. It's fine. Biggest mistake. Trust me, all you budding authors out there, do not try to write 2 books at once. I've done it. I did it. It's not a good idea, because what I very quickly realised is you can't just split a book in half. You have to think about, well, each book has got to stand alone in its own merit. So you can't end up with all the locations that begin with A in one book and nothing beginning with A in the other book. And you can't end up with a book where all the locations that are in, say, Bedfordshire are in one book and there's none in Bedfordshire in the other book. And you can't end up with a book where all the stronger stories are in one book and the weaker stories have ended up in the other book, because you never know with your readership. One of the 2 books might be the only book of yours they ever pick up. So you want it to be as rounded a piece of work as you can possibly produce every time. And then I realised that, right, so if I'm splitting this in half and I need to know, have I evenly spaced everything, I'm going to have to create another database to work out what's going in which book. So I ended up with another database, as if I hadn't got enough already, which I had to colour code to show which book an entry was going in, and whether it was a strong entry or a weaker entry, and a colour code for which county it was in, so as I could see at a glance that they were evening out. And even then I didn't quite manage it, because actually These Haunted Times Volume 3 ended up being a bit fatter than These Haunted Times Volume 4 did. But hey, I got it done. I got These Haunted Times Volume 3 came out in the September last year, and Volume 4 came out in the December. So I managed to do 2 books in 1 year last year, which is like, yeah, no, not doing that again. Learned my lesson.
I can imagine, and that is great advice for upcoming authors. So thank you for sharing that. I'm curious because the UK, your roads haven't changed much from the beginning of the Roman age to current. You kind of just kept the same roads and just paved them or cobblestoned them. And so I'm wondering, is when you say like you have spirits on the roads, have you ever come across like in the house where they look like they're floating up, and you find an old blueprint, they're actually going upstairs that were removed? So I'm wondering, with the roads, have they ever been moved because the road moved?
We've got so many like that. We've got accounts where what's seen appears to be walking sort of ankle deep or even knee deep in the road, and that's because the road they're walking on is at a lower level, like the original road. Like you say, it's been built over the centuries. So the apparition is still walking on the level that was relevant to it. So I've got quite a load of examples like that. I've also got apparitions that appear to be walking in midair, and it seems like they're walking up a staircase or something that used to be in a building that isn't there now, and yet they're still sort of taking the same route. I've got at least 3 cases that, off the top of my head, where they're walking along in terraced buildings. So here in the UK, if houses are joined to each other, I think you call them townhouses in America, do you? But
we do.
Where when you've got lots of houses that are all joined together in a row, we call them terraced houses here. And I've got loads where they're just walking along between, like, from one room to the next, from one house to the next through the wall, because originally that was one house, and has been split into a terrace since, or where rooms have been changed around and now there's a wall where there wasn't one before. I've even got one where it was on an army barracks, and it walked into somebody's bedroom, at night when him and his wife were trying to sleep and got interrupted by a ghost opening their bedroom door and walking through the bedroom. And it walked through the wall next to their bed that joined onto the house next door. And the next day they spoke to the guy who lived next door, and he'd seen it walk through his wall and across his bedroom and out his door. So it had just merrily gone on its path, regardless of what was there now. And I even know of one where it's walking a path and nobody's been able to find out what building was there. But it's clearly following a building of some sort. But the trouble with the UK history is, we go back 3,000 years of history. So a lot of that obviously was not written down or recorded anywhere. So, yeah, in later centuries, we've got blueprints for what building used to be where. But once you get any earlier than about the 1500s, 1400s, you've really got no clue what might have been built anywhere. So, particularly with the old abbeys and monasteries before King Henry VIII decided to destroy them all, they all had a load of outbuildings and what have you, and we don't necessarily have the records exactly of where they were and so on. So in any given location, there could easily have been a building, and actually finding a record for it may never happen. So I've definitely got at least one of those where the ghost appears to be walking in a building that isn't there anymore. It's just walking in a field now, but at the height of, where a first floor would be, sort of thing. So, yeah, definitely, definitely got some. And of course, some people would say that was stone tape theory, wouldn't they? That's a non-intelligent haunting where something's just repeating the past. Or maybe even a time slip type event where something's just repeating the past. But yeah, quite fascinating to think that you can see them still following the paths of something that used to be there.
And it always interests me too, because I wonder if they're the imprint, you would think with the land that they would be able to tell what's there. And so why they walk at the levels they do and not on the upper level like we do, so to speak. And it's kind of interesting, to me, and even in the buildings when they're walking up staircases that aren't there anymore, it's like, I kind of wonder sometimes that the spirits are like, I'm going to walk up these staircases and freak these people out because it's going to look like I'm walking in air and I'm not.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? Yeah, I can imagine them being quite that cheeky, especially some of the trickster type. I've got an awful lot that seem to be a trickster type, either entity or spirit or whatever, depending on your particular belief system or your particular point of view. And certainly all over the UK, we still have a whole load of place names that when you translate into modern English, it's actually named after a boggart. And a boggart is a sort of elemental spirit. If you watch the Harry Potter films, they actually got shown on the Harry Potter film. But they're known, as an elemental spirit. They have never been human, attached to the land in some way, usually attached to a particular feature in the land. And they can take on any form they want, and they like to play tricks. And sometimes they can be quite amusing with their tricks, and sometimes they can be quite sinister. But all over the UK, if you sort of dig around in local records and what have you, you'll find things like Boggart Lane or Boggart Barn or derivatives from the word boggart, farms with the name and bridges with that name, all sorts. Because, like I say, it's such an ancient landscape, been inhabited for such a long time. It does definitely carry that sort of, connotation and so on. So, yeah, who knows?
And I find it interesting because as you were explaining that, it's like in my mind I had to stop and think, I know of the Fae in Ireland and all the different groups of that. And I had to think, I don't know that I've ever heard reference to Fae in England. or
Yeah,
the UK. And it's interesting that I was like, I'm sure it's there, but it doesn't get talked about as much.
not as much. No, it's definitely, like you say, it tends to be more an Irish or Scottish thing, or Welsh even to a certain extent. But we do have reference to the Fae. I've got them in several of my books actually in the UK. There's a little tiny village in Oxfordshire called Kingston Lisle, and I've got quite an interesting story from round there where somebody was absolutely certain it was Fae. And very interestingly, when I was researching the history of that area, I found one of the buildings, and I haven't actually been able to get to the bottom of this fully. So I don't know if anybody's an expert in Fae who's listening to this. One of the very old manor houses in that village was restored back in the 1700s. So bear in mind it was being restored then. You can imagine how old it is now. And when they restored it, there's some very old records, which are a bit hard to follow because they're, in an older form of English. And they mentioned how there was, I can't remember now whether it was 6 or 8 fully grown oak trees that formed the walls of the Great Hall. And they were put in situ, still with their bark and branches all in place, and then incorporated into the walls. So when they came to restore it in the 1600s, when I was reading about it, they had to take 7 of the, I think there were 8. They had to take 7 of the trees out because they started to rot finally. But one of them they left still in place. One was in good enough condition to leave still in place. And I thought, well, that's absolutely fascinating that they left full-grown oak trees with their bark on and everything to be the supports of the house. Because that's not normal in English architecture, to leave the tree, sort of finished, as it were, and put it in. And to have that in an area that I know I've got stories about the Fae from, I wondered whether there was something about, that being part of a sacred grove, or whether it was some sort of protection against the Fae, or, there was sort of some reason behind why that was done related to the Fae. Because it just seemed a bit strange to have that, the way that was done, sort of built into the building like that. Just very, very odd.
Yeah, it might be that they were, because I know in Ireland, some buildings can't be built in certain spots because that's Fae territory.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing that they'll do is they'll leave a natural corner there, and then the Fae allow it to be built there. So maybe those 8 columns or 8 trees were built as to say, hey, we know we're on your land, we respect you, we're giving you this gift, and maybe that's what it was, is to appease the Fae instead of warn them off.
I genuinely think you might be right with that, because it's such an unusual architectural feature. I've never come across it before, in any other sort of UK building that I've researched. So there must have been a reason they did that. And then for me to tie that up with still active stories of the Fae in that area did make me think, I wonder if there's a correlation with, that particular building and the Fae and the way they've done those oak trees.
I almost wonder too if, like, every room has its own purpose. Like, I know that's from olden times to current. Like, you had the study, you had the library, you had where guests met, where you ate, where you danced. Maybe this was a family or a owner who felt deep ties to the Fae and was like, this is a room just for the Fae.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. And like you say, it might have been, it might even have been that was a sacred grove. So, although they were going to build there, they sort of, like you say, kept it sort of incorporated into the building. I don't know. I do know of a case. I had quite a long correspondence with this chap over a period of about, I want to say 7 or 8 months. And he was living at the time. I don't know if he still is, but because it was a couple of years back that I was talking to him, but he was living in a fairly modern built bungalow, that was only sort of 40 or 50 years old at most, this bungalow. And not long after they moved in, they started having all sorts of weird happenings in the house. Bangs on the walls, shadow figures. They'd hear voices over the little baby alarm intercom into their child's room. All sorts of things going on. And he'd had various people in at various times to try and sort this out. So he'd had a priest in, he'd had medium in, he'd had the place blessed, he'd had the place cleansed. And each time it seemed to work for a little while, but then it would just come back again and seem to not really make any long-term difference. And he struggled and struggled with it. He himself wasn't too bothered by it, but his family really didn't like it. So, and he'd given me the story, and I'd written the account of everything that he was experiencing, but hadn't yet published the book. It was early on in the year. And then he contacted me about 6 months later, and he said, "We've solved it." Because prior to then, he'd researched the house, and he'd discovered that the previous owner of the bungalow had in fact died in the house. So he was working on the assumption that the spirit must be the previous owner. And of course, so everybody that came in and blessed or cleansed or whatever was sort of trying to address that entity, if you like, that person. And about 6 months later, when he spoke to me, he said, it was still, it kept reoccurring, and out of desperation, he kept contacting different people, trying to find some level of help. And eventually, a chap who, got in touch with a chap who deals much more with elemental spirits, fey spirit, that sort of thing. And this chap had sort of done some kind of remote reading on his property and looking into the land and so on. And I got back in touch with him and said, right, this is the problem. That at the end of your garden, where it overlooks the field beyond, they're building some new houses, yeah? And the guy said, well, yeah. What's that got to do with me? I've got quite a big garden. That's the other side of the field, the other side. He said, well, there was a elemental spirit living in that field, and it's been disturbed by that building, so it's moved onto your land, and that's what's causing the problem. If you plant a row of trees at the bottom of your garden, sort of on the boundary of where this other building was taking place, and he specified the specific types of trees that were needed, you'll find it settles it down, because it'll recognise that you're giving it a home. So he did that. He'd gone out to a garden centre, and he'd got the specific trees he'd been told to get, just young ones, saplings. But he'd planted them in a row along the hedgerow, as instructed. And within a week, the activity started to die down. By the time he contacted me again, it had been about a month or so, and they hadn't had a thing happen. And he said, I really think we've cracked it. And I've not heard from him since, so I think they have cracked it. But simply by giving back what that elemental needed, and giving it a piece of land to move onto, away from the bit that's been developed, it seems to have appeased the whole situation. So isn't that fascinating? That's still, possible to do. You'd think in this modern day and age it was kind of not the thing, but apparently so. You can still have this kind of problem.
True, and what's really interesting is, I believe it was Hallmark, either this year or one of the previous years, when they were filming in Ireland, or supposedly filming in Ireland, but the movie was based in Ireland, they had one where these people wanted to build a home and they couldn't build it because one of the corners kept having issues. And the lady said, because it's on Fey land, you have to do this to appease the Fae. And when they did it, they're like, yeah, they lived happily ever after since. And it was like, it amazed me. And it's interesting that that's kind of similar to your story. So it's like, wow, Hallmark actually got something right.
Amazing. That's almost as amazing as the story. Yeah, and it just goes to show, you know, we don't know what's really going on within this world in many ways, do we? You know, that's why research like mine, I never see it as my role to give the answer, you know. I see it as my role just to collect the data, if you like. So people often ask me, well, how do you know if people are telling you the truth? You know, they could just be making it up. And I would say, well, yeah, they could do. Because I've got no practical way of determining whether the story somebody gives me is the truth or not. But what are they going to gain from lying to me? Because going back to what I said earlier, remember, most people are a pseudonym in my book, so they're never going to be identified. So then it's not as if they're doing it for their 15 minutes of fame or anything, because the book's not going to give them that, because it doesn't say who they are. So I take everything at face value. I think once or twice in the 8 years that I've been publishing, I've turned a story away because I thought, no, I really don't think you're telling me the truth. But that's literally happened once or twice. The rest of the time, I'm perfectly happy to accept what people tell me at face value, because it's their experience, it's what they've had happen to them. And it's that data, it's that gathering of that people's actual experiences that I think is really important to get that down to posterity, because I lay my books out in such a way that, you know, it's county by county, town by town, sort of location by location. Yes, okay, if it's a private property, I can't give the actual address of the private property, but anywhere that's public access, I give the exact location. Because I think it's really important that future people who have way more intelligence than I do will have a chance to put all this data together and maybe come up with the actual answer. And I also think it's really important to sort of do the research and speak to people who've actually experienced it. Because one of the things I find quite frustrating is, you know, anytime you sort of start looking into a known haunting, you'll find the same few facts endlessly repeated in lots of different sources. And some will just add an extra bit of a twist on, and they'll have a lot of vague sayings in them, like many people say they have seen, or thousands of people have seen such and such. And when you really strip those sentences down and think, many people say, well, who did they say it to? Who caught all that data for you to now be able to say that many people said? You can't. And the ones that put, you know, apparently hundreds of people have been pushed by this ghost or have seen this ghost. Well, what hundreds? Who's collated that? And it's that kind of lazy reporting that I find really irritating, because I think it's much more important to go out and actually find the people that have actually experienced something there. And when you do that, what I quite often find is that a lane or somewhere will have a reputation of being haunted by whatever it might be, you know, an old monk in a black habit, or a ghostly horse, or a, you know, white woman, or whatever it might be. But what I get from people who actually experience something down that lane is something completely different. Still paranormal, still inexplicable, but not necessarily the thing that they're actually supposed to have, be seeing down there. And I think that makes it even more interesting, because to me that says there's something odd about that patch of land or that stretch of road or that building, wherever it might be, that there's something really weird and something where the veil is thinner, or if you think of it that way, or for some reason it's far more active. And I find that particularly locations where I get several accounts where people contact me, about the same location, it's very, very rare for them all to be seeing the same thing or even a similar thing. It's much more common that I'll get one saw perhaps a black shadow, one perhaps heard something, one perhaps saw some weird lights, one perhaps felt cold spots there. It's quite unusual to have any location where people are experiencing the same thing. I have got some locations where people are experiencing the same or very similar. I know anybody that might have heard me talk before will have heard me talk about the lanes around Risley, which is a village about 10-15 miles north of where I live. It's a small village in the sort of top end of Bedfordshire. It might even just be into Northamptonshire, but I think it's in Bedfordshire. It has a story associated to it that goes back about 3 decades, which you'll find in a lot of ghost books or articles about the area. It says there was a farmer who was working on the land, on a particular lane on the outskirts of the village, and he was doing some work to one of the ditches that goes around the field by the hedge, when he heard the sound of a horse galloping towards him. So he sort of straightened up from the ditch he was working on, just in time to have the sound of this galloping horse crash through the hedge right next to him and gallop on down the lane, but nothing to be seen, just the sound. And it was in daylight hours. Obviously, he was working in daylight hours. And that's the story that you can find on quite a few locations. But since I've been researching there and asking locally, I think I'm up to about my 9th account now of people that have experienced something to do with a horse type spirit, a horse type entity. So I've got a couple who were out for a Sunday stroll, lovely sunny Sunday afternoon, and they decided to do a sort of circular route out from the village, across some of the fields, down a couple of the lanes, back across some fields and back round into the other end of the village, such a nice circular route with their dog. And they were walking down one of the lanes, and their intention was to get to the end of this particular hedgerow, where there was a stile that they could walk across a field and a footpath. So they were going to turn right, off the lane, into the field, walk across the field. But as they started walking next to this hedgerow with their dog, they could hear on the other side of the hedge, which was too thick to see through, a horse snorting and stamping and kind of generally getting quite riled up. And they sort of started to chat to each other, and it seems to be upset about the presence of our dog. Not sure it's going to be a good idea to cross the field here where we were planning to. And the husband had sort of said, well, we'll get to the end and have a look, because it might be that there's a fence runs across the field that will separate where we're going to walk from where the horse is, in which case it'll be safe for us to walk along there with the dog. But if we've got to go through the same field as the horse is in, then yeah, we'd better not. So they carry on walking along this lane, along beside this hedge. This horse is still snorting and stamping. They get to the end of the hedge. They cross round the end of the hedge to sort of look into the field, only to discover that there is no horse. They can see as far as you like, across empty field. There is no horse, there's no cattle, there's no livestock of any description that they could have mistaken. There is nothing in the field. So they have no explanation as to what it was that paced along beside them, the other side of that hedgerow. And then similarly, I've got an account where a lass was driving home with some friends in the car, early hours of the morning. They'd been to the local big town to go to sort of, pubs, nightclub, whatever. They were coming home very late at night or early hours of the morning. And as they came down one of the lanes approaching the village, they'd got the main beam of the car on, so you can picture the scene. It's a very old, twisty country lane, not much more than one vehicle wide, a little bit wider than one vehicle. Grass verges with a hedge either side. And all of a sudden, caught in the main beam of the car ahead, a horse jumps through one hedgerow on the left-hand side of the road, gallops across the road in front of them, and jumps through the hedgerow on the other side. Except that the entire time that they saw it was no more than 2 or 3 seconds. It was just the outline of the horse. There was no solid infill to the figure. So what they actually saw was the outline of a horse jump through the hedge, picked up by the headlights of the car, run across the road and jump through the opposite hedge. So how do you explain that? And like I said, there's about another 6, and all of them, they're all different, like that. Those 2 stories indicate, and yet they all involve a horse spirit of some sort. And I've even had somebody who, about 4 or 5 miles as the crow flies from that village, was out lamping one night, which is shooting rabbits using a high-powered red lamp to pick them up in the dark. They don't react to the infrared, so you can see them. So he was out lamping with his red light, and he had a horse gallop past him in the dark. And he'd got his lamp shining, and there was nothing there. But that was about 5 miles away from that village. So whatever's gone on around there, it makes you wonder, is it one particular spirit? Is this somebody riding a horse that's left an imprint? Is it a horse-type spirit itself that's left an imprint? Or if we looked back over history, and this is one of the problems we have with British history, that could easily have been one of the sites during the English Civil War, or even one of the other, battles even earlier than that, with the Romans or with the Saxons or with the Norse coming across, or anybody, because we have so many sort of invasions and battles and what have you over thousands of years. Is it actually a remnant from one of those battles, horses galloping about in this area? Is that what this is picking up? And no real way to know without gathering the data. So I just keep gathering the data and hope that one day somebody will be able to piece it all together and sort of figure out what's going on. But isn't that interesting?
It is, and there's one aspect I think you've kind of skipped over that could be one of the possibilities is highwaymen.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
They would have been horseback, and they would have been living a dangerous life. So something could have happened to the horse with the highwaymen on it, and so the horse is just going through its daily routine of trying to stop someone or get away.
Yeah, we've got a huge... highwaymen were a huge problem in the UK for centuries. For a large part of our history, the rural roads in between habitation, inhabited areas, were very dangerous places to be. Highwaymen were a real issue across the whole country. So yeah, it could easily have been highwaymen. Yeah.
And for the people in America or not in the UK, the term highwayman refers to what we would call like a carjacker or a thief or burglar. They were the criminal aspect who tried to rule the road.
Yeah, but they were always on horseback. The term is always applied to somebody who's a thief on horseback. And what they would traditionally do was they'd kind of wait on a particularly dark or treacherous bit of road, hidden in the shadows to the side of the road on their horse, and they favoured dark-coloured horses for exactly this reason. And then they would stop lonely travellers or coaches, because a lot of the travel was done by coach and horse around the UK, which is why we have so many coaching inns still, even now. And they would stop them and hold them up. That's either sword point earlier on or pistol point later on, and rob everybody who was on board. And obviously some of them were more volatile than others. So we've got some very famous highwaymen, but we've also got, there were plenty of them that were just rogues. They were quite a scourge of the problem in between towns. So yeah, I know of one that his ghost is said to, and he's a highwayman ghost, and he's said to appear almost not exactly on command, but in response to a certain type of vehicle. So when you bear in mind that highwaymen traditionally most often robbed people riding on horse and carts or horse and carriage, or particularly the coaches that went from one town to another, because that's how people travelled between the towns. So if you imagine a coach is essentially a sort of barrel-shaped vehicle on four wheels that will seat, 4 or 6 people inside it. And he still appears on this particular road. It's just north of Sheffield in Yorkshire, in the north of England. And he will still appear if you drive an estate car or a minibus, something that holds more than one, the normal number of passengers in it. So like the modern day equivalent, if you like, of a coach. And my correspondent there was telling me that when he was a teenager, so going back sort of 30 years or so, 20, 30 years, they used to do it as a dare. The teenagers, they'd drive their cars up there. And they were able to sort of show that if you drove either a minibus or a big estate car, which I guess you might call an SUV in America, that you were more likely to see him. Whereas if you went in there in just like a little sleek sports car or a ordinary saloon car, he wouldn't appear. So he's obviously still triggered by something that looks like something he can rob, which is interesting, isn't it?
It is. And two of the things that I find interesting is when we think today of the term highwaymen, we're picturing 2, 3, 4, 5 maybe people, but that term also refers to one. And why they don't call him a highwayman, it's like, I don't know, but I guess highwaymen became more of a title than a description. And the other thing I was curious about is I've read, but I've never been able to confirm, the highwaymen would rob everybody, or would they rob only specific coaches? Like if you were a poor farming family driving your cart through, would they let you pass, or would they still rob you? Because I've gotten mixed stories about that.
It depends entirely on the highwayman, to be honest. So there are plenty of areas where, anybody that went through was going to get robbed. But we had main coaching routes here in the UK. So if you wanted to get from one town to another, all those coaches went along the same route. And there was overnight stops, at periodic intervals where they would change horses, and that, so horses were stabled at the coaching inns. And this is why you have all these inns all over the UK with the big archway at the side of them, because there used to be a coaching inn, and they would keep fresh horses there, and the coach would just swap horses, rest the horses overnight, and then set off again the next morning or whatever. And so the highwaymen would know which route these rich travellers were going to be taking. So that's where they would be waiting. So that's why quite often it was those travellers that got caught. But yeah, in other areas, I mean, there's somewhere, I can't remember where in the UK it was, but there's somewhere where when they caught the gang of robbers, it turned out to be the monks from the nearby monastery that were doing it.
Really?
Yeah, and they were dressing up as highwaymen, and going out and robbing, and they were literally robbing anybody that passed down the lane that went across it. It was across a moor somewhere. And then, you know, taking the riches back to their monastery. And it was particularly shocking at the time because several people had been caught and tried for the offence and hanged. When it you know, then it later transpired that it probably wasn't them at all. It was probably these monks doing it. So, and I'm fairly sure that the sort of ringleader behind it was actually the abbess, was actually a woman. So yeah, British roads over the centuries were very, very dangerous places to be. And I think on the whole, you were in more danger if you were richer, but that wasn't to say you were safe.
No.
You know, whatever your sort of financial status was.
You know, and that raises an interesting question too, because in those days, people of the church were deemed untouchable because they were of God. So if you had these monks, you know, robbing people, how do you try them? How do you convict them and punish them because they're of the cloth? And it's like, wait a minute. So did that actually create the perfect criminal, so to speak?
It probably did, because when you really look into the history of some of the monasteries and what have you, there were some atrocious things went on at them. You know, because they were above the law for quite a lot of their existence. And then, of course, you know, the English religious landscape changed so dramatically when Henry VIII was in power, because he wanted to have all these blooming wives, and you know, he's the 6 wives of Henry VIII, and you know, beheading the ones that got on his nerves, and you know, was generally not a nice guy. And when the Catholic Church wouldn't let him get rid of his wife in order to marry Anne Boleyn, because he had his first wife, lasted quite some years.
Catherine, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was one of the Catherines, but she didn't bear him a son, and he desperately wanted a son. And his courtiers sort of waved this very pretty young girl under his nose, Anne Boleyn, and he wanted her. And the church said, well, no, you're married, you absolutely not, naughty boy. So he changed the religion of the UK and left the Catholic Church and introduced his own religion and tore down all the monasteries. It's called the dissolution of the monasteries. And the majority of them got torn down in the space of just a sort of 5-year period. And their lands were given out to, you know, friends of his at court. And the monks and nuns were turfed out on the street. And it was a shocking time in English history, because, you know, it was people's religious faith being attacked. And in order to justify what they were doing, in a lot of cases, they made up completely spurious false allegations against the nuns or the monks, you know, whichever building they were wanting to give away to one of his friends at court. So it's very hard now with British history to try and pick apart, because of course these all became official court documents or whatever, but to try and pick apart now whether it was true what they were being accused of or not is nigh on impossible in most cases. You know, and all these big, you know, centuries old, very rich establishments were just literally ripped apart and given out to nobles, who started using them to, you know, have as big estates to party in and you know, have their hunting parties in and so on. So it was quite a shocking time in British history. And yeah, from that point onwards, you know, very difficult to know whether some of the charges being levied against religious people then, who had been, like you say, so untouchable up to then, and now all of a sudden were being accused of all sorts of horrible things, how much of that was true and how much of it was just propaganda by the king and his court, you know. So, yeah, very, very twisted, dark history behind all of that.
There is, and one of the other things that I'm kind of curious your opinion of, and I know it's potentially not a factual basis, but since we're talking about highwaymen, Robin Hood, would you classify him as highwayman or outlaw, and what's the distinction?
Robin Hood was an outlaw, and the main distinction there is because if true, if the stories of him are true, and there's a lot of debate about that, he was a nobleman who lost his lands and therefore became an outlaw, came outside the law. Whereas a highwayman is almost always, not entirely always, because I know of a couple that were noblemen, but it was almost always just a commoner who turned thief. So that's the difference, is that you're an outlaw. It usually meant that you had started in law, if you know what I mean. And yeah, so Robin Hood was a nobleman who lost his lands, lost his title, and went out into the woods and became an outlaw and started his band of merry men, and so we have the history. But even with that, we don't know how much of that is true or not true. There's all sorts of theories about it. I'm not by any means an expert on Robin Hood, but yeah, there are all sorts of theories. Some people have certainly discovered who he was in reality. Other historians argue that, and I haven't read widely enough on the subject to know quite what the various arguments are. But it still rages as an argument as to whether he was a real person or not.
Right, and the reason I asked is because Nottingham exists, there's Locksley exists, so it's like all the names that are attached to the story exist.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, if you're the king or the historian, are you gonna write the story of a guy who was lands taken and ended up besting the king, or are you going to keep that out of history and go, no, our king was just, our king was this, and so
and that's exactly the problem, because such historical records as survive the test of time tend to be the ones from the court, the ones from the noble families, the ones from anything from the poorer section of society was unlikely to ever have been written down, and any oral tradition sort of will stay alive to a certain amount of time. But the actual records, like you say, they're going to reflect the story of whoever's writing them, aren't they? And whether that's the truth or not is an entirely different question. But there was nobody to write back then. There was nobody to write the other side of the story and get it put into the history books, was there? So right. Yeah, you've only got the one set of information, and if you're a historian at that time and you're writing down a modern history, you're not going to write something that the king doesn't want written about him, are you? Because you're going to be the next in line to lose your lands and your title if you do.
That's if
so. Yeah, it's
going to. That's what they'll do. Usually, the king would just execute you and get a new one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which is sad, because that now calls into question every historical document in existence, because it's like, under what circumstances were these written? Why were, who wrote them? What was their purpose?
Yeah.
So it's like...
And what was the political landscape at that moment? Yeah.
So it makes us wonder, will we ever really know the true history?
Probably not. Unless sometimes we find out, or we get a better picture of history when a hidden trove of documents comes to light or something like that, don't we? or like when they found Richard III under a car park in Leicester, and finally found his body in the UK. And then you get a bit more to add to the puzzle, don't you? And add to the sort of history and so on, and a bit more to add to the ghost stories, of course. So,
and when he got dug up, he was sitting there saying, "Thank you for finally finding me and freeing me."
Yeah, finally getting me out from under this goddamn car park.
Yeah, like enough of driving over me. I had enough people trying to, ride over me, so to speak, in my day. I don't need more cars doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing thing, isn't it? But we're a very, very, very small island in geographical terms. When you compare the size of the UK to, like the size of America or something, we're just tiny. We fit inside some of your states, I think.
Actually, truth be told, I live in the state of Texas, and I think the record is 4.5 of the UK will fit in Texas. That's how big our state is.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all. And so when you think of that, if you think of a quarter of Texas with as many people as we've got in the UK, and I don't know what our current number is, and going back over as many centuries as we do, or thousands of years as we do, their history does, almost every inch of that land has been lived on, tramped on, walked on at some point in history. The only bits that won't have been is the very tops of mountains and the very bottoms of some of the lakes and what have you. All the rest of it will have been built on, walked on, tramped on, had roads on, had battles over it, had love affairs over it, had kings come and go over it, tribal chieftains before we had a king, Roman soldiers marching up and down it. Just every bit of land has got layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of history on it. And untangling that and then finding where a paranormal occurrence might fit into that is an endlessly fascinating topic.
Mm-hmm.
Just this field that's behind my house here, I live about half a mile out of our village in just a little isolated row of houses. So there's fields front and back out of my house. And the field behind me is called Redlands. That's the old field name. And nobody knows why it's called Redlands. There was no Redlands Manor or Redlands family or anything like that. And the most likely explanation is that at some point there was probably a skirmish or small battle here. And the Redlands comes from, it would have been called Bloodfield or Blood Grounds or something at one point.
That could be, or it could be a tribe was riding through going to raid somewhere else, and might have been a bunch of red trees, and so they go, "Hey, look, there's the Redlands."
Yeah, it could be as simple as that. Yeah, absolutely.
But an interesting thing that I've discovered recently is I used to tell everyone, being a historian, through degree, England is a older history than America, and I've recently found out that's not true anymore. That we have
you don't having a scrap.
Something. But we have found, like our Mississippi River, that there are places in Illinois where they found these tools that were thousands or tens of thousands of years old. And they thought, that was just this. And then they mapped it to the Phoenician coins and found out America was being mined for copper in the Bronze Age, or for the bronze. And so we were active just as the amount of the same time you were active. So our history is actually the same. It's just we don't document and we don't acknowledge that history here for some reason. We like to say, "Oh no, we're only 200-300 years old," not counting the native lands. And it's like, No, we're tens of thousands years old. We got a lot more history here than what's being shared.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I guess there's a difference in degree of civilization in terms of actual building on the land, that aspect of civilization. But I think you're right. I mean, just in your indigenous peoples, their civilization, which was a more nomadic lifestyle, but was nevertheless still a civilization,
Yeah,
still goes back thousands of years, doesn't it?
it does, and
But doesn't necessarily leave such an imprint on the land itself
well,
because of the nomadic style, you know?
that's true, and yet there are like so for those who aren't familiar with American geography, like Oklahoma is a state that's landlocked. There's no water access, but yet there are Norse symbols carved into rocks there. Egyptian hieroglyphs, I believe, found there too. And all these different like tribes that we were told never stepped foot this far into America, or was never in America to begin with. And we're like, wait a minute. Now we're finding these symbols and we're understanding what these petroglyphs are. It's like, wait a minute.
Wait a minute, just what is the history? And I did read a fascinating book. I can't remember for the life of me what it was called. And it's easily over a decade, if not even 2 decades since I read it. But that was a history about Chinese travel back in the 14 and 1500s. And the author for that had pieced together some very convincing historical snippets and bits of record on that strongly suggested that the Chinese emperors were regularly sending people out to America to mine for, like you say, for treasures and gemstones and gold and whatever, whatever interests them. But there seems to be record of traveling across the seas to America from China. So I think you're right. I think, your history is a different style of history to ours. Ours is one where people built towns and villages and fought battles and invaded all the time. And whereas yours is a history of
mining
and, sort of passing through and taking from the land, or passing through and living in harmony with the land, one or the other. But either way, it all leaves an imprint, doesn't it?
It does. And I think in a way too, it kind of, in a strange way, to me explains why. And this is my personal opinion in this moment. When America severed ties from Britain and became America as we know it, how the small area of land could overtake the empire. And it's like, well, if we think about, there were more people there than we realized. So maybe, some of the battles, the armies may have been smaller than anticipated because maybe they got picked off by people living in the woods that history never accounted for. Like, we even have a movie, The Last of the Dogmen, and it was a tribe of natives that were living in a forest that time had forgotten. And so it makes you think, because a lot of the battles were, in the wilderness, were never accounted for.
No.
They always tell you everything happened in the main cities and the main colonies. And it makes me wonder now if that's because there were people coming out of nowhere they couldn't explain. And they're like, how do you tell the king an army of men wearing strange clothing, using weapons we've never come across, or ancient weapons, bested us? You would never tell them that, You would
No.
just say, "Oh well, they got caught up over here because they're already in trouble over there." So it was a quick skate.
Yeah.
And
And
so yeah,
there's the added thing that you still get the whole problem of documentation, don't you? Because, you know, if you're a cohort or a troop of, say, English armed men, and you're moving from one fort to another, you know, to defend the sort of territories or what have you, and you're picked off and you're all but destroyed, there's nobody there to document that, is there?
no,
You know, somebody might come across their bodies and think, oh, you know, either the Americans have destroyed them, or, you know, when it was English, French fighting over territory there, or it must have been a troop of French that come through and killed them. Because nobody stayed alive to write it down and make, like you say, the one or two that perhaps escaped, they're not going to be believed if they say something different to, oh, it was the Americans, or oh, it was the French, or, you know, whoever they were currently battling at that moment in time. Yeah, it's all about the survivors get to tell the story, don't they?
they do. And again, it's the case of, like you were saying, you know, if you're, say, a corporal and you're reporting to the captain, where are, you know, the 500 men that came with you? And you say, I'm the only survivor because these guys with stone axes just kicked our butts coming out of nowhere. The captain's going to be like, you were nipping into something. You guys did something. Where are they? Since you're not telling me the truth, we're going to flog you and you're going to spend some time in the stockade. So yeah, there was there's no way to know what really happened. And we have to also look at, in these times that we're talking about this, to go from, like we're saying, one fort to another, you know, could be, say, 100 miles, in which we look at today and we're like, well, that's a couple hours by car. No big deal. These people moved by horse, and even the horse moved as fast as the man on foot. So that could be a 3-week trip.
Yeah.
And
there were no roads anyway, were there?
No. And
so it's travelling across, you know, unfootpath territory, isn't it? So you've got to fight your way through bushes and across rivers, and, you know, there's no path through it, so that slows it down even further.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, we had to be naive to think, oh, the troops can move 3 weeks untouched between forts, you know, because everybody respects the rules of combat. And it's like, there are so many skirmishes going to be happening along that road, and there could have been an American version of Highwaymen even that might engage them.
Easily, so, yeah.
It's like, it's funny how we sit there and we accept these accounts as, okay, this is what happened, and nobody questions, well, what happened in between?
And I think that's why doing research and like, I mean, I don't claim to be any hugely proficient researcher, but I do at least try, rather than just endlessly repeating what you see written somewhere else about a haunting or something paranormal is so important. I mean, there's one of my accounts in the Roadmap of British Ghosts, the first one. And when you looked it up, you look at any other account, it all gives a particular location in South Devon. And I went out, social media there, and I tried to find the exact location, and I was really struggling with one of the names, one of the place names mentioned in the stories that all repeat this endlessly. And when I finally managed to unravel it and speak to enough people locally, it turned out there are 2 villages in Devon with this name, one in the south, one in the north. and the actual haunting happened at the one in the north. But all the books and articles that you sort of see online all wrongly cite it to the one in the south. So I've put that right in my book. So no, actually, guys, it's this one, because this is the one that used to have a pub called, I forget the name of the pub now, but this is the one that had the pub with that name originally and had the crossroads where the ghost hangs out at the crossroads. So, you know, you get those kind of mistakes repeated. And that's just with known history, you know. You can imagine how much more it gets repeated with history that hasn't even been documented properly. And I've got another one where...
I was going to ask real quick, how do you... Because I know, like, here in America, New York was once Amsterdam. New Amsterdam. They did a famous song about it. And townships change names. So how do you, when you're doing your research, and if somebody says, oh, say Derbyshire, if you go and you go, well, here's Derbyshire here, but how do you know that's the Derbyshire they're referring to and it's not another spot that was renamed something else?
It's Derbyshire. We pronounce it Derbyshire. I had to think for a minute what you were talking about then.
I just pulling out a random name.
Yeah. But something we have happen all the time throughout our history is if you take any given county and its borders with the county next to it, they're forever changing the borderline. So, you know, for 50 years of our history, this particular village might have been in, say, Northamptonshire, and then for 50 years it might be in Cambridgeshire, and then for 50 years it might be in Bedfordshire, because they change the county boundaries all the time. Not, you know, you'll get a good number of decades in between them doing it, or even a couple of hundred years in between them doing it. But if you go back far enough, you get this problem with the county lines changing. But the other thing is we have an awful lot of repetition of names with the villages. So, you know, you'll get a village called Horton, and there might be one in Derbyshire, there might be one in Lancashire, there might be one in Cambridgeshire, there might be one in... And so sometimes if a lazy reporter starts to sort of pick up on a ghost story or something, and they accidentally, or just because they're being lazy, transcribe the name, and they think, oh, the village of Barsham, oh, that's in Suffolk. Well, that's the most well-known of the Barshams, but there are loads of other Barshams around the country, so you better be sure which Barsham you're talking about. And I know the same happens in America, you know, that you've got a load of repeated names and you have to be sure which state you're talking about, or you'll be picking up entirely the wrong name, won't you? But we also, and I'm sure again this probably happened in America, is we reroute our roads sometimes, or we rename them. You know, so it might have been the B653, but then it got renamed the C72, or it might have started. So for example, the A1, which is known as the Great North Road. I mean, that is originally a Roman road that went from London straight up north. And you know how the Romans are famous for just going in a dead straight line.
Oh, yeah.
So the original A1 was more or less a dead straight line from London up to sort of York. But over the centuries in between, it's deviated from its path and, you know, wiggled around more. So it's no longer a straight line. And they've built new bits of motorway or dual carriageway and called that now the A1. So the old bit of road now gets redesignated as with a new name or a new number. So the modern day A1 is, you know, maybe in places half a mile or a mile away from where it was originally. And what was the A1 is now called something like, you know, the A307 or something, because it's no longer part of the main route. And I'm sure that happens in America as well, that places get renumbered and renamed. So when you're researching backwards and trying to find a specific location, particularly when I was doing the road map book, if you're trying to say to another ghost hunter, if you want to see this particular paranormal entity or to go and look for it, and you're trying to be precise about which bit of road, you have to be very careful not to just go, oh, it's on the A1 by Sandy or whatever. You have to go and look through the map, see how old is the account that you're sending people to look at, sort of thing, and has that road moved location or name since then? In which case, where are we currently looking at? And that can get quite interesting. Because sometimes I move an actual ghost. Everybody else is reporting it in like that Devon one. I've moved that about 30 miles north. People have all been looking in the wrong places. Where it is about 30 miles away in another direction. But in other places, it's just a matter of, half a mile or so. But if you're going to stake out somewhere and wait for something paranormal to happen, you don't really want to be half a mile away even from it, do you? You want to be where it is. So yeah, it can take quite a bit of tracking down.
Hey, here's our lantern. We're over
here.
We're over here. We'll wait.
You just carry on. Either that or they're lined up, all of them a quarter of a mile away, laughing their heads off and going, look at those idiots. So parked up in the wrong place again.
Should we go mess with them, or should we just let them be?
Should we just let them get on with it?
No. So we're actually approaching an hour and a half. So what do you have coming up? Anything that you want to promote or anything?
Yeah, I've gone slightly mad. Because like I said, I went a bit mad last year. I wrote 2 books. I thought, what can I do this year? What shall I do this? And I thought, I really fancy looking at American ghosts. I've done 8 books on UK ghosts. So I'm currently researching and writing book number 9 is about American ghosts. So all you guys listening out there in America, if you see one of my posts on your local social media, Ruth Roper Wylde, asking about ghosts, please do get in touch and talk to me. I mean, so far, where are we? We're in July. I've been doing this since the beginning of February. And I'm getting some absolutely brilliant responses from American people willing to talk to me, willing to tell me about their ghosts. One wonderful, wonderful lady, actually, I had a video chat with her like you and I are doing now, and she walked me around her haunted house with the video going so as I could see what she was talking about. So, the next book will be These Haunted Times, Volume 5, but America. So that's the current one. Is I'm venturing across the pond in virtual terms and seeing about your ghosts.
Yeah, I'm curious. Are you going to use the correct locations, or are you going to call them all American? Because if the spirit is like, say, 1600s, America didn't exist yet.
Well, yeah, that could get a bit complicated for a book title, though.
I meant in your research. When you call out the location, are you going?
Yeah, I guess it all depends how old the ghost itself is meant to be, doesn't it? If people kind of know what's haunting.
Doing genealogy, it always would crack me up because my sister did it, and other people are like, yeah, we have family that moved to Virginia in 1720, and they go and they died in Virginia, United States of America, 1730, and I'm like, newsflash, there is no United States of America in 1730, so I had to go in and erase that.
I had a very similar but different problem when I was writing the Almanac, which is the calendar one. Because I think it was 1732, but I'm sure somebody will jump up and remind me of the date. It was sometime in 1700 anyway, 1700s. The UK changed its calendar, and we went from the Caesarean calendar to the Gregorian calendar.
So did we.
And it was 11 days difference here. So on that October, they did it in the October, people went to bed on the night of October the 3rd, I think it was. And the next morning they woke up on the morning of October the 14th, I think it was. I'd have to check my records to be certain, but we lost 11 days overnight anyway.
And a month. We also lost a month.
Oh, we didn't.
There was 13 months in the original calendar, and then when they changed it to the Gregorian, it went to 12 months. That's why we have a leap year. Every 4 years is to account for that one day to try and balance out the missing month.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never read about a 13-month one. We've always listed 12 months here in ours, but
and that's why August appears before October, because August was supposed to be the first month. They were in alphabetical, and then they moved it. That's why the Latin names don't match up.
Yeah,
anymore. They're like, August is September. What? And they're like, yeah.
But it means a lot of our anniversary ghosts don't match up because the battles were prior to 1730, whatever it was. You know, so if you're saying that, like, for example, the Battle of Edge Hill, if you're saying you're going to go and see, because that's supposed to be able to still hear the sounds of that, well, if it's prior to 17, whatever it was, you're looking on the wrong date if you go the date of the battle. You have to account for the calendar change. Or you have to assume that paranormally they would still honour the same calendar date, you know, which is always possible, I suppose. But I
don't think the spirits are going, well,
what date is it?
Today, so our haunt's been pushed back because they changed the calendar.
Yeah. When do we clock in for our overtime this night? Yeah, you can tie yourself in a lot of knots with this.
Oh, I know. Time is one thing that is not in our favor. And it's so confusing. And it's everyone thinks it's natural and it's not. But so thank you for coming on and sharing with us everything, and hopefully we'll have to get you back on to share some more and let us know what you find in your American research.
It would be my absolute pleasure. It's been so much fun talking to you. It's been a really good evening. So thank you very, very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And if any of you want to reach her, all of her links will be in the description. So thank you for watching. Thank you again, Ruth, for coming on. And hope everyone makes it a blessed day, blessed evening, wherever you are in the world. Fill it with love and joy. Have a great one, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.